What is the most iconic object from pre-Columbian Mexico? Undoubtedly, it's the calendar stone of the Aztec Empire. This round disc has been reproduced in every conceivable medium, and endless words have been used to write about it. The familiar image of the stone appears on the paper currency of Mexico, on keychains, clothing, and even tattoos. It's probably one of the most famous excavated objects from the ancient world. You might think that everything that could be said about it has been said, but strangely enough, it hasn't. Despite all the attention, it's still an object of mystery. An enigma, really, which has not revealed all its secrets to the modern viewer. The Aztecs did not write about it at all, so it has to be examined carefully on its own to be understood. It needs to be put in the context of what we know about the Aztec Empire from Spanish accounts and the Aztecs' own history in order to understand its cosmic significance. So, what is this stone, known as the Piedra del Sol, or sunstone in Spanish? And why is it so difficult to figure out the meanings of the images on the stone? Ironically, it's an object that appears simple to those not aware of its meaning, but it's actually quite complex and still an enigma, even to scholars. Well, first of all, the calendar stone has nothing to do with 2012 and the so-called Maya calendar ending in apocalypse. The stone is not Mayan, and it is not a calendar for keeping track of time. It does, however, tell a story about the previous Aztec eras which ended in destruction. So the idea of different ages of creation and destruction is there. It's a particularly Aztec idea, not Mayan. The Maya were notable for their long count, dates found on their monuments, which were dates that were figured from a fixed date in the past. But the Aztecs here were thinking in terms of the dates of the ages of creation. Probably the calendar stone is more connected with cosmic events and with human sacrifice than with telling time, and we shall see why shortly. Let's take a look at the facts and see how such stones were used, and then what's actually represented on this stone. Then we'll look at the interpretations of its meaning and compare it to other smaller stones with similar but much simpler images. Here it is. The calendar stone was excavated along with our previous masterpiece, the colossal statue of Coatlicue, in 1790 on the grounds of the central square of Mexico City, the Zócalo. The Zócalo in its previous incarnation was the central plaza of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. The Spanish destroyed the main temple, the Templo Mayor, and stones from the Aztec period were reused in colonial buildings. The Aztec statuary was buried in the mid-16th century in the aftermath of the Spanish conquest and a terrifying smallpox epidemic. The two most prominent pieces, the colossal Coatlicue and the calendar stone, were not seen again until their accidental unearthing in 1790. Calendar stone was buried face down to deflect its powerful imagery. When it was found, the calendar stone was put on display at a tower of the cathedral. The calendar stone is made of basalt, and it's about 12 feet in diameter. It weighs about 24 tons. Unlike other Aztec round discs of a similar character, it's irregular, since it has this ragged stone edge, looking to some people as if it were not completed. It's also by far the largest and most complex example of this kind of stone sculpture, and indeed of any Aztec sculpture. It's the most intricate, beautiful, and detailed enumeration of a cosmic scheme made by any ancient American culture. That's what makes it so important and such a masterpiece. There's a date at the top of the stone, 13 Reed, in the Aztec calendar, which works out, according to some scholars, to 1479. It's also a date associated with the gathering of the gods at Teotihuacan, when they created the four-earthquake sun. 1479 was during the time of the rule of the Aztec Tlatoani, or emperor, named Axayacatl, who ruled from 1469 to 81. Some say the calendar stone was carved for Moctezuma II, also known as Montezuma, the last Aztec emperor. The Aztec Empire itself had grown vast and influential in only a fairly short period of time before Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1590. It was at its height and seemed to have been in power for a bit more than a century, at least according to their own accounts. Here you can see how large and to what a great extent the empire had grown. One of the most important aspects of the empire was its alliance with and/or conquest of many different neighboring peoples, from the Pacific coast to the Gulf Coast of Mexico, and in a mosaic of regions down to Oaxaca. These allied and conquered peoples were required to give tribute to the Aztec capital, the center of Tenochtitlan. Many goods were exchanged in this way. The economy was based on this tribute in such things as valuable woven cloth, cacao beans, animal pelts, feathers, jadeite. All this was given to the emperor. Most remarkably, however, part of the tribute consisted of people, men and women, who were destined for sacrifice. It's debated exactly who these sacrificial victims were, but many seem to have come from neighboring regions and from the center of the empire as well. Ceremonies were held where the sacrificial humans had specific duties. Different kinds of people were offered to specific gods at designated times. Now, some high-status captives were offered on a special sort of stone disc, like the calendar stone, but smaller. And these sorts of sacrificial vessels or platforms were termed huauxicalli in Nahuatl, the Aztec language. The sacrificial person was stretched with his back over the stone disc and held down by 4 attendants, each holding one limb of the victim. A priest made a quick incision in the chest with a special flint knife, reached into his chest and removed the heart. The heart was then offered as a precious gift to the sun, the precious eagle cactus fruit. Blood would be caught in the central depression that was usually carved into these stones. The large circular stones were set on the horizontal, as you can see from the Duran Codex illustration, and the calendar stone was most likely meant to be horizontal as well. We don't know if the calendar stone was used as an actual huauxicalli or just meant to look like one for symbolic reasons. There was also another sacrificial use for this shape of stone. One of the most interesting sorts of sacrifice was a kind of mock combat, a gladiatorial contest between a captured warrior meant for sacrifice and an Aztec warrior. The tribute warrior, or sacrifice, was tethered to a round disc of a stone, rather like the calendar stone, but smaller, usually with a hole drilled through the middle. The sacrificial warrior was given a weapon which consisted of a sort of wooden club or sword studded with feathers, rather ineffective. He then engaged in combat, obviously pretty limited by being tied to the stone, with another warrior who had a real weapon, a club as well, but this one was studded with sharp and cutting obsidian blades. This weapon was called a macahuitil, and it was capable of serious damage. You can imagine that this sort of combat was unfortunately pretty one-sided. While this may seem a bit shocking, remember that gladiator combats we are familiar with from Rome, for instance, did not involve great odds either, especially if a victim was set upon by hungry and crazed tigers or lions. This type of combat, remember, was also made to be a part of a religious rite, which must have legitimized the action even more. Plus, the viewing of such a bloody ritual certainly served to strike terror into the hearts of those who might oppose Aztec rule. Now, these are the possible symbolic associations for the shape of the calendar stone, but what seems to be most important is what is actually represented upon it. We have a series of carved concentric circles, some cut much deeper than the others. These bands are in turn divided into rectangular compartments with smaller motifs inside them. Let's start from the center. You see a sort of monstrous face which appears to have its tongue sticking out. This is not a tongue, but a sacrificial flint knife, just like the ones used by priests. We also see dots or beads below the neck, which have been interpreted as drops of blood. Large claws that seem to be extending from the face grasp human hearts. This blood and sacrificial imagery seems to imply that the face itself is of a god, one who has been decapitated and sacrificed. For over 200 years, scholars have not been able to agree on exactly what god this is meant to portray. It could be the sun god Tonatiuh, or the consuming earth monster Tlaltecuhtli, or a combination of them, or even some other deity. It could even be the night sun or the earth monster consuming the sun, an interpenetration of the sun deity and the earth deity. As we already know from the Coatlicue statue, the gods are often shown dismembered or as sacrificial victims. Perhaps the message is that the sun has fallen on the earth in a final cataclysm, as some think. The outline of the sign in which the face resides is the glyph for Nahui Olin, or for earthquake, the date of destruction of the present era. So this central image is of the fifth sun, meaning it's all about the destruction of the world and the end of the current era. This central image of the calendar stone has 4 flanges around the face, which are associated with the 4 previous eras of the Aztec cosmos. That central date, the final one that's given, is for earthquake. The smaller ones, starting on the right and going counterclockwise, these rectangles or flanges portray the dates of destruction of the previous eras. Here's one version of the story. The first sun, or era of creation, was called 4 Jaguar, 956 BC to 280 BC, supposedly. Giants who lived then were devoured by jaguars because they did not perform their duties to the gods. The next era, 4 Wind, was 364 years, and it had monkey men in some versions who were destroyed by hurricanes. 4 Rain, ruled by the water deity Tlaloc, ended when its denizens, who were near human beings, were destroyed by a rain of fire and supposedly eaten by turkeys. The last date is 4 Water, which was an era destroyed by a 52-year flood, and within which men drowned and maybe turned into fish. These are some pretty vivid and scarily specific cataclysms, and we've only looked at the very central part of the monument. This present creation began on 4 Earthquake, or 1195 AD. Tonatiuh, the sun god, was created for this era. This creation was meant to be stable, and if blood sacrifice was made to the sun god, then it could possibly last forever. Constant, penitent sacrifice of blood to the sun was required for this era. So the symbolism we see here was all about the Aztec current era. They foretold that if the blood sacrifices ceased, the world would end in earthquakes, specifically the death of the sun on the day for earthquake. In the deeply carved background of the ring surrounding forward movement, you can also see a few smaller date glyphs. The one at the top right shows the date 1 flint knife. We also see 7 monkey, 1 rain, and a headdress glyph. Now, we think that these dates refer to actual historical milestones in Aztec history. For instance, 1 flint may refer to the day that the Mexica tribe left their mythical homeland of Aztlan and set forth to found their new capital, Tenochtitlan. So we have a sort of historical record here as well. A ring of 20 day names circles the central image of the present creation. This is the Mesoamerican ritual calendar, which consisted of a 260-day cycle. It was called the Sacred Round, and that's what's depicted here. We see the day names start slightly to the left of the pointer above the central face. The first day is alligator or crocodile. The next to the left is wind. After that, house, lizard, serpent, death, deer, rabbit, water, dog, monkey, and so on. To the right, you can see the day's movement and flint knife depicted in miniature compared to their larger characters on the central face. This round of days was not meant to depict an actual date, but rather to represent the counting of time itself. In this 260-day ritual calendar, there were the 20 day names, interlocking with 13 numbers like interlocking gears. Now, this 260-day calendar was an important characteristic of all the Mesoamerican pre-Columbian cultures. It was not related to any solar or astronomical calendrical features that we know of. Most likely, it could have been related to the length of pregnancy, 9 months. In fact, people were named after the day name of their birth in this ritual calendar. The next ring of carvings consists of a repeated design of 5 dots called a quincunx, which seems to represent preciousness, or maybe jadeite. Set upon this ring are 8 rayed emblems, which can be interpreted as rays of the sun. The next ring of images is obscure. They may have some representations of feathers, beads, and our blood, but it's really not clear. Clearer, however, is the final encircling ring. That consists of 2 thick fire serpents, or dragons, called Xucoatl. Note the significance of serpents again, just as we saw in earlier Mesoamerican cultures, like those of Teotihuacan and the Maya. The fire serpents' tails are at the very top, with their pointed ends framing the date of 13 reed. Their bodies are divided into square segments that have butterfly symbols inside them, and the serpents encircle the whole disc, only to end with their open maws at the bottom of the stone. These rather nasty-looking serpent faces have noses or perhaps tongues that curl up and back. Revealed in their mouths are 2 more deities. The left deity is the sun god Tonatiuh, and the one on the right is Xiuhtecuhtli, the fire god. Star signs stud the tongue or nose of the serpents. One interesting thing about the more or less human-looking faces of the deities on this stone is that they all look quite ferocious. They have open mouths as if screaming or biting in a hostile and aggressive manner. The numerous teeth are depicted in a threatening way too. So you have, in a sense, the image of an aggressive, imperial, and warlike culture which believed that its very survival depended on war, penance, and tribute to the gods. And that tribute had to be human blood and hearts. If you think about it, even the animals here are depicted with open maws and sharp teeth, so everything is potentially threatening and destructive. This enormous sculpture not only encoded a message about cataclysm and cosmic destruction, it also encoded the warlike imagery of the Aztec nation itself. It must have been an imposing and threatening message to those who saw it. There was serious intimidation going on here, and cooperation must have been coerced through the art. Also, remember that the very shape of the stone itself called to mind the ultimate human sacrifice of blood and hearts. This was the kind of monument which reminded the populace of the center, the city of Tenochtitlan, and of the peripheral provinces of the empire, of the power of the gods and of the rulers, and the state itself. Destruction of the sun and the universe itself hung in the balance. So obviously, obeying the authorities was the best course to follow for survival. But the stone doesn't end here with its outer ring of fire serpents, nor do its mysteries. The ragged-looking edges have some meaning as well. These unfinished-looking side areas depict the constellations or star demons, which cause the eclipses when they attack the sun. They are part of the Aztec cosmic mythology. Star demons were terrifying beings who were responsible for the eclipse of the sun and, by extension, the death of the sun and the earth itself. Eclipses were moments of terror for the populace. They interpreted them as the death of the sun. The only way to keep the sun moving in the sky was to feed it human hearts and blood. As we talked about earlier with the statue of Coatlicue, the gods sacrificed themselves in order to create the sun and the moon, and thus humanity was always in their debt. Now, let me explain that this stone was the greatest in its class. There were other examples, but smaller ones, of the Cuauhxicalli, or sacrificial stone. Probably the best and most interesting to look at is the stone of Tizoc. This stone was found buried in the Zocalo just a year after the calendar stone in 1791. Tizoc was the Aztec emperor who came after Axayacatl, and he wasn't very successful. He didn't last very long, just about 6 years, from 1481 to 86. However, his stone is a masterwork of propaganda and cosmic imagery. It sheds light on the meaning of the calendar stone. And when we compare them, we can see what a masterpiece and great accomplishment the calendar stone was. So here it is. You can see that this stone, which is proportionally thicker than the sunstone, has a much simpler design on its topmost surface. The rayed image is meant to be the solar disk, and it's very similar to the calendar stone, although much simplified. You'll note that there is a carved depression in the center, which was meant to hold the blood of sacrificed warriors. So it's likely that this stone was used as a Cuauhxicalli for sacred sacrifices. On the stone of Tizoc, the interesting part is actually represented on the thick sides. It's here that we find we have a sort of cross between a historical document and a religious one. There are 15 repeated images of Tizoc, carved in very sharply cut but fairly shallow relief on the surface. Tizoc is not shown as himself, but rather in the guise of a god, Tezcatlipoca, he of the smoking mirror, and or as the god Huitzilopochtli, the patron deity of the Aztecs. Tizoc is depicted conquering neighboring places in this repetitive motif in which he grasps the hair of the personified town and vanquishes it. In reality, Tizoc had a reputation as a bit of a coward, an unsuccessful ruler. The interesting thing about Tizoc's monument is that it combines historical events and places with the cosmic ones, just like the calendar stone. Tizoc is shown conquering or claiming to have conquered actual places like Xochimilco. On the surface of the sacrificial stone, we have the sun. On the underside, we have the earth monster. So Tizoc is depicted in the middle or earthly realm, holding apart the sun from the earth monster. This device gives the ruler a central role, not only in military expansion, but in cosmic terms, just like we saw in the Maya world with the Egyptians and the Indian and Indonesian stupas. The calendar stone is clearly a similar but even more significant Aztec monument, which functions on several levels at the same time. It combines some historical dates with the cosmic scheme of creation and destruction of the previous eras. It commands, in a sense, the continuation of sacrifices to the sun through its imagery. And it places all these variables in a mandala-like scheme of really great complexity. We still don't understand everything about it. So great is the content and information depicted. Whatever the final exact interpretation of the calendar stone is, we can take away from it some interesting knowledge about Mesoamerican culture and its relation to the cosmic scheme of the universe and the deities. When you recall that the deities are often depicted as sacrificed or dismembered at the moment of death, you may ask why this should be so. What was it about this culture which caused it to believe in extreme penitential suffering, auto-sacrifice, and human sacrifice as a debt to the gods? And what effect might it have had on the art of Mexico today? Perhaps the sacrificial theme is really about controlling the populations of the empire through terror and intimidation. You can imagine that seeing as many as 1,000 sacrificial victims having their hearts torn out on the top of a temple and seeing their heads displayed on a skull rack had to have had a strong effect on coercing cooperation. This sort of activity was like ruling with terror, and probably few societies have done it on this scale. If you recall, the Assyrian reliefs depicted similar types of fates for war captives. They showed impalement, flaying, or beheading. Now, these sorts of illustrations of deeds had a powerful effect and served a similar purpose to that of public human sacrifice, but they were less visceral than seeing an actual sacrifice. When it comes to the art of Mexico after the conquest, and even today, you can see the effects of the Aztec heritage. The depiction of gods at death or in the aftermath of gory sacrifice probably had some influence in how they saw and depicted the images of Catholicism. In Mexico and elsewhere in Latin America, the sufferings of Christ are usually depicted in a more realistic and almost brutal manner than in much of European painting and sculpture. They show it with lots of blood, suffering, and physical pain emphasized. The penitential aspect of religion is more important there. When I visited as a child, and you can still see this today, I was so impressed because people made the pilgrimage to the cathedrals, particularly to the Virgin of Guadalupe, by walking on their knees, sometimes for many, many miles. Some bear large wooden crosses on their backs. So the requirement of personal suffering for the sake of piety has not disappeared. The ubiquity of skulls in Mexican art today is another influence of pre-Columbian culture. We see the skulls of victims of sacrifice depicted on skull racks from Tenochtitlan. Today, they're even created out of spun sugar for the Day of the Dead. Modern Chicano artists have used the motif of the skull to bring forth their past. The calendar stone and the day signs are extremely popular for tattoos among Chicanos in the U.S. In another nod to the ancient culture of Mexico, the contemporary British artist Damien Hirst created a skull covered entirely in diamonds. It supposedly sold for $100 million, although some think this might have been a ruse. According to the artist, it takes its direct inspiration from Aztec sacrificial skulls. Who can imagine what else will take form from this tradition? Next, we go to South America to examine a different culture and its masterpieces, that of the moche. This motif of death and sacrifice and militant warfare is featured prominently in this culture as well. We'll look at something found in a burial of an elite man, an ear spool, which serves as a microcosm of the moche world.